All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 9, Section 2, A Vibrant Capitalist Republic. So let's recall 9-1 was the rise of industry. And that had a profound impact on the economy. It created a much larger market economy. A market is any place where people buy and sell. So people were buying and selling a lot more than they had before. And it was much more of a long distance economy because you can transport things via the railroad much more efficiently, and a much more interconnected economy, meaning that if something happened in one part of the country, economically speaking, that could have a ripple effect throughout the entire U.S. economy. And we have one of the first earliest examples of this in the form of the Panic of 1819, which was an economic downturn. So let's first start with land, right? Land. So here we have a map of what they called the Ohio Territory. This was land that was acquired by Great Britain through the American Revolution. It was land that the United States sold to speculators. Speculators were people who anticipated land prices to go up, right? The idea is to buy low, sell high. And especially after the American Revolutionary period, one of the only ways that the Articles government could raise money was to sell land in the West. And so you had these speculators who went out there, bought up an enormous amount of land. This craze for land in the Northwest was referred to as Ohio fever, right? So this might be the craze to buy Western lands. And so land offices were set up to sell the land, right? So land office sells the land. And a lot of people took their money out west, bought it low in hopes that they could sell it up high. This includes speculators, but also farmers. And what was happening in the West was not just an economic transformation of having more landowners, but also cultural. You see this in the form of things like literature, artwork, etc., etc. And this was to transform the West from wilderness, which had sort of a negative connotation. Remember, the West was kind of like on the edge of civilization, culturally speaking, for most of colonial and American history, to more of a positive outlook, which was the frontier. And that was kind of an area to be explored, to be cleared. It was where men could prove their bravery. It had a much more positive connotation, right? So the frontier or the West had a much more positive connotation than wilderness. So this economic downturn, or the Panic of 1819, does have its connection to this land fever out west. And that was essentially banks would provide loans, and those loans would go to land speculators, right? And farmers, essentially, farmers. Right, of course, with the idea that eventually that would have to be paid back, right? So let's maybe get our green out here. We'll get some dollar signs, right? Dollar signs goes to land speculators, goes to farmers, and eventually they're supposed to pay that money back, right? That's the idea. That is only if the price of land actually goes up, right? That's the idea. That's how they're going to make their money. The same thing is true for farmers who did that. However, because there was such a desire, there was such a craze, right? Such a craze over land, that banks began to issue more and more paper money as opposed to specie. Specie is what we call hard money, right? Specifically gold or silver, right? And instead, banks were handing out paper money, right? And paper money has its purposes, but is much cheaper, right? Maybe it's not as responsible as specie or hard money. And so increasingly paper money was used to fuel essentially what becomes a land bubble. In order to better regulate the American economy, Congress helped establish the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. This was part 2 of Alexander Hamilton's National Bank that had previously expired. The idea was that the Second Bank of the United States was going to come in and create a more uniform currency. It could regulate the state banks who are producing too much paper money, but it also created a system in which, and again, we'll kind of go back here, right, to this example. Maybe let's mark it so we can better understand the economy that's going on here. Right. So we have banks who are providing loans to land speculators and farmers who are then going out and buying the land. It's assumed that they're going to go ahead and pay these banks back. However, the state banks can borrow money from the national bank, right? So we have an additional kind of connection here. So the Second Bank of the United States is giving money to state banks and smaller banks. Those banks are providing loans, and now land speculators are going to go out there and do that. The Panic of 1819 begins when crop prices crash, right? And you're going to see how this whole thing unfolds and leads the United States into a terrible economic situation, because these banks are not just providing loans to land speculators and farmers, but of course, they're responsible for providing loans for any sort of business, right? Businesses rely on banks for loans. And so the Panic of 1819, right? And you can kind of follow the rolling ball here, so to speak. Crop prices crash, right? What does that mean? Well, that means farmers especially, and even land speculators, because land speculators would buy the land but then sell it to farmers, right? These speculators aren't going to be working the land themselves. They're out there trying to make money. But when crop prices crash, that's what farmers sell. The farmers get wiped out. The farmers can't pay back their loans. Banks, having borrowed money from the Second National Bank of the United States, they can't pay that back, right? So the banks go under. And once the banks go under, then American businesses begin to fail. And so when we talk about this point about the U.S. economy being much more interconnected and long distance than it ever was before, you can begin to see the ripple effect that something like a crashing crop price could affect pretty much all of American businesses. And that's what happens. Banks failed. Businesses failed, the price of land plummeted, farmers couldn't pay back their loans. There were actions to try and relieve some of these economic measures. The land law made smaller pieces of land available, right, at a cheaper price. The Relief Act meant that farmers could give back land that they bought but couldn't afford. But this panic lasted for a good 4 years, and it had a tremendous. It's going to leave an imprint, right, on the United States. So this rapid sort of fluctuation of crashes or boom and bust, right? That's a good way. This is an illustration. Maybe we'll write this in green of the boom and bust market economy. And that's pretty much what the United States is dealing with after this point, right? The boom and bust market economy. At the same time, though, even though the economy was in some ways a lot better, it was also a lot more vulnerable to things like crashes and whatnot. It was also a great time in inventing and entrepreneurship. The United States in this particular period, this industrial period, was referred to as a laboratory of innovation. Innovation is more or less new ideas and inventions, some of them having a very important impact on American life and really on the world. Probably the most notable of these was Eli Whitney. One of his inventions, the cotton gin, this removed seeds from cotton. All right, here's a picture of the cotton gin. Most of that labor was done by slaves at that point. Eli Whitney had actually thought that this would decrease the number of slaves, but in fact it led to more slaves being needed, because even though you could take the number of seeds out, right? So cotton has seeds in it. You typically used to have to use your hand and try and pick them out. That took a very long time. The cotton gin, you just kind of throw the cotton into this machine, you spin the thing around and the seeds just come out. The reason why it led to more slaves and not actually less, because you actually needed more slaves to plant and pick rather than take the seeds out. So you actually see the number of cotton, you see cotton production increase, and you see the number of slaves increase, which is certainly not what Whitney had intended. You see the invention of machine tools and the creation of standardized interchangeable parts. This is, in fact, a very brilliant invention that in terms of production, when you make something, rather than just making it from start to finish, like things were typically done before, you make things as a series of interchangeable parts. This was done primarily with guns, right? So if you make a gun and you have the barrel, the trigger, and the, the tube that shoots the thing out, if you make it a series of interchangeable parts as opposed to just one single gun, right? If, let's say that this thing breaks back here, right? Whatever that's called. Well, then you can simply just replace it, right? Because all the parts are standardized, meaning they're all the same, and you could just change it out. Whereas if you have a finished gun where it's all made and this part breaks, you have to replace the whole gun, right? And this was actually brilliant in reducing costs, right? And allowing people to, pretty much interchange these parts whenever they wanted to. This greatly aided industrial production. A couple of other important inventors, all of these are associated with the inventions that are listed below them. Robert Fulton invented the steamship. This was to take the steam engine and put it on boats, right? We see a picture of a steamship right here. And typically before, right, ships were sailing ships. They were essentially at the mercy of either the wind or the water. So let's say, the current is going this way, water-wise. The wind is blowing this way. Well, before the steamship, guess which way that your ship is going, right? Your ship's going this way. You have no choice about it. But with the steam engine, as long as you put on enough coal, it doesn't matter which way the wind is blowing. It doesn't matter which way the water is going. You actually have the power to overcome the natural world and to go against this. This greatly increased the amount of, or greatly decreased the amount of time it took to travel. You could carry far more cargo. Rivers, which had typically been one-way streets, now you could go both up and down. So it greatly increased the amount of commerce that could take place on the water, right? And led to even the construction of canals, which were man-made rivers, because now it made financial sense because you could sail both up and down a river. You could never have done that before without the steamship. Cyrus McCormick invented the mechanical reaper. This made harvesting wheat much easier, which led to more food, which of course led to better health, right? Which of course led to things like, living longer, et cetera, et cetera. John Deere, the steel plow, this again increased food production. Also at the same time, decrease the price of food, right? So food becomes cheaper. So more food is more readily available thanks to McCormick and John Deere. And you can see, a blueprint of, I think this is a reaper right here. I'm not exactly sure. And lastly, Samuel Morse, who invented the telegraph, which is long distance communication, right? This is through wire. And Morse code was the language of the telegraph. Oops. And again, before, in order to communicate previously, you'd have to have actually a physical communication, sending a letter via horseback or something like that. Telegraph wires were established throughout the United States. And, just by having these wires, you can send a message. We'll go yellow here. You could send a message electronically. And of course, Morse code was a series of beeps and dashes, right? So you'd either beep it once or you go long, and there was a corresponding alphabet in which you could translate messages. So now you could communicate over very long distances, whereas that was never possible before.